Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment. Welcome to tonight's presentation on the early history of video gaming. I'm very glad you're here. We're going to start now, and there'll be others coming in, but I know what Miami traffic is like, and it's always tricky to set a particular time. But I think I know you're anxious to get the talk started, so I just want to give you a bit of background. This is a part of a series of lectures and panels that are being presented by the Center over the course of the year on the theme of the conjunction of humanist and scientific thinking. We had a very good panel in September at the Wertheim Performing Arts Center talking about the mechanics behind theater productions and how science and aesthetics combine. In the spring, we'll do the same with an opera production, and we have several other talks lined up talking about examining the way thinking in both the sciences and in the arts are informed by one another. Tonight, I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce two filmmakers who have worked on a project on the history, the early history, probably most accurately the middle history of video games. Video games programming has been around since shortly after World War II, and it was a process of the computers, the hardware, catching up to the programs, having enough ability to run some of these programs, and then once the hardware was in place, it moved back and forth between the software being ahead of the hardware and vice versa. I'm going to stop before it sounds like I'm about to give the lecture, but I think this is a very interesting topic, and I'm very, very glad that Jeanette Garcia and Daryl Rodriguez agreed to come and talk about their film and to answer any questions that you might have. I do want to mention one more event that's coming up next week that I think might be of interest to you. Next Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m., Jeff Soloway, who works for a publishing house in New York City, will be coming to talk about what it's like to the choices that are made in publishing books on the humanities, material on the humanities, what you can expect if you're trying to get a book published, and what the future of the publishing industry is going to be like over the next few decades. If you have any interest in publishing yourself or in working in publishing, I think it'll be a very enjoyable lecture. I'd be happy to give you more details after this talk, and if you'd like, you can sign up for to be on the Center mailing list so you won't miss an announcement. Thank you again for coming, and let me turn the podium over to Daryl and Jeanette.
Our presentation is called Video Games Where Technology Becomes Art. I'm Jeanette Garcia.
I'm Daryl Rodriguez. So we start off by basically pointing out that a lot of the times when people would create certain inventions, they didn't really create it thinking, oh, this is gonna turn into an art form. For example, when you could say what we now recognize as film, they didn't think, oh, this is film, this is cinema. They didn't look at it the way we look at it. So, for example, Edward Muybridge decided to take not just one photograph, but multiple photographs in succession of a galloping horse. And then in that, you have, with one photograph, you can tell a story, but with two, you have a narrative arc. You know, the horse went from left to right, or whatever the case may be. And soon after that, they invented cameras that would take multiple photographs, just one camera, because Edward used multiple cameras. And eventually in the 1890s, these films, what we know as films now, started being presented to people in public. They didn't have movie theaters back then, obviously, so a lot of the times they were presented in music halls, places where people would gather to watch, a show, a play, for example, or a concert. And then in the 20th century, film pretty much became what it is today, and we think of it, I personally think of it as the art form of the 20th century. So eventually, obviously about 50 or so years later in World War II, this is pretty much where the beginning of computers started to come into play. And a lot of the creative and scientific minds in the world were caught up in the war. So a lot of the purposes for building computers and using them were for military purposes. But after the war was over, some people like Alan Turing, for example, started to use computers for purposes outside of military purposes. For example, he wrote a chess program for a computer at the time where there wasn't even a computer that could run the program. We found that a lot of the early computer pioneers, for some reason, decided to gravitate towards building an application, building a game for their computer. And this is in different parts of the world, different people. It just sort of happened when you look back and see that happened.
And one of these companies that were trying to sort of be innovative and create new applications or new ways of using computers was Ferranti, an Australian company. And John Bennett worked for this company, and he actually presented a game called Nimrod that actually made it to the 1951 Festival of Britain. And in the game, basically, it functions with lights. It uses lights to determine the placement of matches, right? So players are presented with several piles of matches. Each player takes turns to remove one or more of the matches from any of the piles, and the player who removes the last match wins. So this was one of the early concepts of how computers were kind of being used to use games, to have games function on them. And then later on at Stanford, MIT, sorry, Steve Russell developed Space War, which was the first game that sort of had an actual visual CRT display. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the most sort of, appealing and visually captivating, because it had a star field and a ship that you could actually move around. So.
One of the interesting things about Space War is that using the CRT monitor, you could have different colors, you could have different shapes, you could have lines. So you go from having a blinking light or a light that's on or off or whatever, and moving towards the realm of painting, different colors, different shapes.
And then within the manual actually of the Nimrod game, John Bennett made it very explicit where he stood in terms of the function of the game, of a computer game. It may appear that in trying to make machines play games, we're wasting our time. This is not true, as the theory of games is extremely complex, and a machine that can play a complex game can also be programmed to carry out very complex practical problems. So he was trying to make a statement of just, how vital it was to actually experiment and to try out the game within the computer. And so Nolan Bushnell, who co-founded Atari, he actually realized that actually looking at Space War and other games that were sort of out there at the time, but mostly in university spaces, he noticed that these games could actually be publicized, right? Like bring it to the public, make it more accessible for more people to play. And that's where he developed Computer Space. He was actually able to create Computer Space out of without using a computer. So basically using solid state technology, he was able to create a star field with a ship that you could move, similar to Space War, but a little bit more engaging and sort of with these functions of rotation and thrust, so it became a little bit more complicated to play it. And many of the engineers enjoyed the game very much, but it wasn't too accessible to other people, to the common people. And that's what kind of led him to rethink the concept of computer space and try to create a game that was a little bit more accessible, that sort of made a connection with the audience a little bit better, and that allowed them to play it more easily.
The thing about Computer Space is that, or Space War, is that the computer costs tens of thousands of dollars to make, that's how much it cost. So if you wanted to charge people a quarter per game to play the game, it's gonna take a long time to get that money back. So Computer Space maybe cost, I don't know, about $1,000, something around that range.
Right. Okay.
And it was basically made on, as she said, not with a computer, but if you imagine like your remote control, if you open it, it has like a logic board. They pretty much built one of those for the singular purpose of playing the game.
Yeah, and the microprocessor came in and sort of allowed this model to change. So now we were able to have memory, and we were able to do more with these computers. and that caused the games to kind of get more interesting and be able to do more with the games. Actually, draw out the capability a little bit more and make them a little more creative. So.
One of the things that the microprocessor and using computer technology brought, and memory, stuff like that, is that the performance of the computer with a computer was a lot better. So what that brought a higher demand to the designers or the creators to use their creativity, more of their creativity. For example, now you can use more colors on the screen, so you can realize your vision better, and you can realize something better than a space, a black background with white dots, for example. And also in the characters, drawing the characters out, sketching them out, you could do more with that, higher resolution, so it demanded more creativity out of these engineers.
And the thing about the code.
Oh, and also, you also have to, when they say, they use the computer, they wrote code, but it wasn't like today, for example, where you have a program and you can use words to type your code, and then the program will say there's a typo in your code, there's an error in your code. They type their code into punch cards, which is basically like the equivalent of writing a book using Morse code.
It was a very complex process, not easy at all. And anytime they made an error, they had to basically start all over again because they couldn't just go in and fix it. So here we're just going to have Donna Bailey, the creator of Centipede, talk a little bit about her creative process and what she did with the technology.
She talks about pretty much the graphics, the colors of her game.
Mm-hmm.
One morning, our technician was doing something. He had taken the game cabinet and rolled it over into the middle of the lab, and I was watching things change on the screen, and suddenly all
Oh, sorry.
the colors went to these really vivid colors. He went through this place where there was like a super bright, vibrant pink and a really vibrant purple color and a better blue, like a really intense, deepened blue, and just this great place. This isn't right. You can't leave it like this. And I don't care. Is it dangerous? And he said no. And I said, I don't care if it's right or not.
So, to expand on the short clip, what basically happened is that somebody made a mistake, and she was there, and she realized, oh, I like the way this looks better. So she made that decision of, this is not about fun, this is not about, like it was in the beginning of Atari, making a program that's more complex or more impressive to the programmers, to the engineers. She said, I like the way this looks, and even if it's wrong or it could be even dangerous, this is what I want.
Yeah, she was more concerned about the look and the feel and the aesthetic of it than really like aiming to score a big score or have it be a competitive kind of game, even though it was, but her focus on making it was to make it immersive. And one of the ways that she actually did it was also in the game mechanics. She decided to use, instead of a joystick, a trackball, because she felt like it was very smooth and sort of like the appeal of it felt better in playing the game. So all of those aspects went into like how she approached sort of this concept of the centipede and getting rid of the centipede. And here's another creator, Franz Lansinger. He's going to talk a little bit about his process.
Crystal Castles had a really cool looking trackball, and the cabinet itself had this weird kind of marquee that kind of popped out, and it was kind of 3D, and the whole game, of course, was built on this isometric perspective, and it was meant to look 3D.
It's a kind of a crazy game. People accuse the game of being inspired by recreational drugs, but that is untrue. Just I'm naturally creative and kind of crazy.
So Crystal Castles is one of the first examples we see of somebody saying, I want a character in my game. I want the world to have a purpose. I want my character to have a purpose. And that's pretty much the way he went to it. And also it's one of the first games to have an ending instead of going on forever or just becoming too difficult for the player to get their money.
And as you can see, he created each stage very uniquely, very different. So the landscape of the castles were very different, and he also implemented interesting enemies. So he created like these weird looking witches and these haunting trees and these ghouls. So he really did take a lot of time also in terms of the enemies that Bentley had to face. So a lot of time went into designing what these characters were going to look like, which was pretty interesting. And it actually contained warp zones, which hadn't been seen before. So if you actually fulfilled the collection of the gems by a certain time, you got the chance to warp and skip certain levels, which was something that hadn't been seen either before, which was cool.
He did some drawings for me of a character. And I made him walk around the screen. And what can we do with this character? I did these animation routines to make him walk, run, jump, crash. And I thought, well, amazing. And started working on this guy, Major Havoc, which we didn't call him that. I think his name was Rex originally. I had probably about 80 bytes of code left that I could use up. And just being very obnoxious, there was a little window in the bottom corner. And I said, well, I'll put a breakout game in there. Even in the animation, if you leave him alone next to a wall, you'll leave him on the wall. If you leave him alone away from a wall,
Major Havoc is one of the first games that used a 2D game or a 2D engine to make it look 3D. And Crystal Castle is also one of those, so I'll let them share the credit on that one. There's other ones as well that we couldn't have here, but one of the other things about Major Havoc, again, it's a character in a world, and they both have purposes. When you have a new type of monitor, a vector monitor that uses lines to draw things, as you can see, the characters are basically made of lines. You can't draw too much detail, so what he did was go for use the animations to give the character his personality.
And the vector design was very eye-catching, especially in the dark arcade. It kind of popped out. So he did decide to go vector versus raster. Raster is when basically the screen draws each line, right? So it's very different. It's very pixelated. Whereas these games, the vector games, are very sharp and kind of draw your eye, draw your attention. If you remember the Star Wars game, one of the first Star Wars games at the arcade was also a vector game, and it basically drew the Death Star with the vectors just like that too.
And the colors were a lot brighter on the vector games.
So once Atari started to see that the arcade was doing so successful, they wanted to kind of bring games home, right? To have people be able to play these games in the comfort of their own home. And at first, they started to just port the arcade games into these these cartridges, right? So that people can experience different worlds and sort of like engage with these different aspects of the games. But then they started to create new content. They wanted to create new games because they started to see, okay, wow, we've sold 250,000 copies. This is great. Let's keep creating games. Let's keep making games, but this time not just ports. Let's do original work, right? And keep in mind, the technology behind the VCS was very limited. We're talking about 128 bytes of RAM, which is nothing. It equates to like about one typewritten page of code, so that's like nothing. It's like a page. If you open your Word document, you type stuff on there. That's what they had to work with. So it wasn't a lot. And it did use the 6502 microprocessor, but like I said, it was still limited technology. It wasn't much to work with. So they really had to, find ways to figure out how to deal with this technology. And then here we have Owen Rubin actually discussing how it works, how the technology works, because I know it's a little complicated.
He basically describes a way they went around it and sort of hacked it to get the vision that they had.
Yeah, to fit their needs, their creative needs, basically.
these guys figured out, basically, in a raster scan, you've got a beam drawing on the screen. It draws every line top to bottom. And the hardware knows how to put stuff out there, but it doesn't know how to put detail like these guys were getting. And the way they were getting them is to actually count the number of cycles that the processor had run, so they would know exactly where the beam was on the screen. And then they would change what the beam was drawing by hand, not letting the hardware do it, but they would physically say, switch now. And they would count a couple cycles, switch again, count. And by doing this, they were able to actually draw like they were drawing with pencils and crayons. When they were writing for the VCS, the comments had numbers next to it. And the numbers were how many cycles that particular instruction took. So they could know how many instructions they had to wait before they did something.
Should we just go on to the next one?
So to go over that again, what he basically says is that on the old TRT TVs, there's an electron gun that paints the screen or lights the pixels up, and the VCS, the Atari 2600, could not do that precisely. So they basically just monitored where the gun was, and then when it was where they wanted it to be, they would use it then. That's how they drew like small fonts, for example, which is
Like the
pretty much
Activision
impossible.
logo and so here we have Yar's Revenge, which is quite interesting. We'll talk a little bit about it after the clip.
Yar's Revenge. It's my first game, and I wanted it to be special. I wanted everything about the game to be special, because I don't have any controllers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to name the character Yar, because Yar is Ray spellbound. And then I'm going to name the solar system, the Razak solar system, that's Kazar spellbound. So I'm working Ray Kazar, the CEO of Atari's name, into the title of the game.
He was still forced to use the small 4K ROMs. And he needs this neutral zone to be animated in the center of the screen, this force field. Well, he doesn't have room left to draw a sprite. And so what he comes up with is a way to stream the game's source code. When you are playing Yar's Revenge, you are watching a representation of the source code stream across the screen the entire time.
So Yar's Revenge was yet another game that had some kind of a backstory to it, to the point where a comic book was created that accompanied the VCS cartridge that it came with. It talked about Yar, this creature from another planet, who was basically out for revenge because he had been sort of accosted and his people were basically killed. And he modeled the character after Ray Kazar, who was actually the manager, the CEO of Atari after Nolan Bushnell left. And Ray got a lot of heat because of the way that he was treating the company and the way he was managing Atari. So Howard decided, well, I think I'm going to incorporate that tension that Ray's feeling into this game. So he created his entire backstory. And it's really interesting, as you heard, the force field, he improvised. He said, okay, well, I can't create it, so I'm just going to run code. I'm just going to make the force field out of code. And that's how it's going to happen. So he didn't compromise. He didn't say, oh, I'm just going to take out the force field. He managed and kind of manipulated the technology to make it still express what he wanted to in the game, which was really interesting.
Howard is a very interesting person. Like he says, that was his first game, and he kind of went into it with the attitude of like, this means something to me. This is something. This represents me. I want this to be special.
Mm-hmm. And it's also the first game to have a pause mode, which kind of helped you to, if you needed to rest from the experience, you could pause it, which had never been seen before until then. So that's something we take for granted, but he actually came up with it and developed it. So here we have one of the most impressive games, Adventure. So
The most impressive Atari
he says the same thing.
One of my housemates was a guy gone to college with Julius Smith, and he took me over to the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab. There was this game that everybody was playing called Adventure. It was all text. You type text and go from place to place by typing go north, go south, go up, and so forth. And there'd be obstacles, and you could use one of the objects you picked up to get past the obstacle. It happens to the original text adventure game by Don Blues and Willie Krautner. And that set me on fire when I saw that. That lit the fuse. This network of rooms that had objects in them that could be moved from place to place. That's what I wanted to do for my next game.
Robinette was building the first big sort of world.
I had this boss who wasn't very imaginative. It wasn't Larry Kaplan anymore. It was a guy named George Simcock. He didn't get Atari at all. The text adventure took several hundred K of memory on the computer at Stanford. There was 2K or 4K available for the ROMs for the Atari video game. So he said, it's impossible. Don't work on it. There's no way you could do that. I ignored it. I went and just started working on it. I worked hard, 12 or 15 hours a day.
He wanted a game where you used items from an inventory, so he created visual representations of items. Oh yeah, of course you have items in games. No, before that, he made that up.
The VCS was designed to play Tank, Pong, and maybe a few other games. It had these 5 movable sprites.
2 moving objects that you could shape however you wanted. two other objects that you can shoot back and forth, a couple of bullets, and then one ball. So 5 sprites altogether.
I used the ball to be you, yourself, the avatar of the adventure, and I used the detailed graphics, the good sprites for objects. I used a playfield for the walls of the mazes, and I even used the missiles because I put them on either side, and occasionally I would need a wall on one side but not the other. So I could use missile 0 for the wall on this side and missile 1 for the wall on that side. Could turn them on and off as needed. There are 4 creatures in the game, you might say. It had 30 rooms, and it had 18 objects total, depending on what you're willing to count as an object.
You know, you had your ports of Space Invaders, you know, endless shooters and platformers, but you also had the emergence of truly narrative-based games like Adventure.
As much as people talk about things like Legend of Zelda and games like that much later, Adventure was that first game that really took the kind of the concept of that type of game, and instead of going for a high score, instead of doing that, you were exploring.
So Warren Robinette, he plays those he loved those text adventure games, which are basically, you could say, an interactive book. And as he said, the original text adventures were several hundred K, and he had 4K available. So it was, as the guy said, it's impossible. So what he did was he went straight to his vision, his imagination of the text adventure, and just translated that to, or drew that with Atari.
And then one interesting thing on top of all this that he's done is that he also included the first Easter egg in a game. So what he did was in one of he created like a secret room, and then in the secret room he put created by Warren Robinette. So the whole deal with that was that during that time, these game creators weren't getting any credit for their hard work and for everything he had done, right? He basically did something that was supposedly impossible, and yet on the cartridge it just said Atari. It never presented who made the game. So this was his sneaky way of getting his name in there and kind of, putting a signature kind of like on a painting, saying, I made this. This is my artwork. This is what I did and what I worked so hard for, as a way to sort of get credit for it.
And one more note for Warren is that as Jared in the movie says that the Atari could only handle 5 objects on screen at a time, and Adventure has about in total 30-something different objects. The way he did that was that the Atari used assembly code, and he was taught in school to do object-oriented programming, and that's how he achieved the different looks for those objects.
Yeah, he combined that technological aspect with his creativity, his creative background. And then also, he wasn't the only one that was unhappy about the situations at Atari and sort of like how, these game designers weren't getting the credit. There was a group of them that actually left and formed Activision, which you may have heard of before. 4 engineers, including David Crane, got up and said, you know what, you guys aren't appreciating us, we're gonna go make our own company. So here we have David discussing sort of his process and how he created Pitfall, basically.
We really wanted to do original games. Fortunately, my mother is an artist and insisted that all of her children would learn how to paint. When I studied art, you spend hours and hours and hours and you get one painting, which is actually what attracted me to video games, that I could make a great video game and maybe sell millions of them.
Being a programmer meant you were also the artist and musician and, the scenario planner and in many ways the marketer too.
What I would do is I would just sit at my console and fiddle with the 2600 and see what it can do. What else can it do? If you think back, the Atari 2600 liked to have inanimate main characters, but I wanted to put a human figure on there that was articulated. I would walk around the lab, and I would freeze in position of walking and sketch where my legs and feet were.
So David, as he says, he grew up, his mother envisioned him as a painter, as an artist, and he likes to think, I like to think as well, that he traded his traditional paintbrush for his digital paintbrush because he's one of the best programmers ever. You say he has that reputation now.
Yeah, because he was able to form actual distinctive sort of, Warren Robinette did the same thing, but for him, he was able to do not only the jungle in the background, right, so he had the background, but then you had Pitfall Harry, who was this, you can tell he was a man, right? It was a man, and he was jumping around. You could tell what he was doing. There's scorpions. and you can tell because he drew them so well that it's a scorpion, there's crocodiles. So he went into great lengths to make sure that you knew what each of these items were, and despite the limitation, despite that 4K limit, he was able to create 256 screens within 50 bytes of code, which is, again, very impressive. And you can see why he founded his own company and, told Atari to, forget it. Don't want to work for you anymore.
And one of the things that Howard Scott Warshaw mentions in the movie is that the engineers, as they were called at Atari, were not 100% engineers. They were 50% engineers and 50% something else, artist, writer, musician, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were involved in something else. They didn't just program games. They had different backgrounds. Some of them were even, he said, like boat builders. So they manifested their creativity in many different ways, not just games. So it was pretty interesting. And I mean, as you can tell, creativity was big at Atari. The founder, Nolan Bushnell, stated, "Creativity was really our weapon. We didn't have enough money, so we created a very open culture where everybody could be creative. We don't care when you come to work. If you come to work, get your job done, and we're happy." And that's the philosophy that all these programmers that you heard about sort of lived under. So they didn't have any pressure. As you can see in the photos, they're very relaxed. They got to wear whatever they wanted. They had flexible schedules. As long as they met their deadlines, there wasn't any real pressure on them, as long as they got the game done. So they had a lot of creative freedom, which Warren Robinette really valued, right? They gave us enormous creative freedom to be able to do these games. And Howard Scott Warshaw approached it as art. He saw video games as art, and he stated that in the film. So all these creative minds together created some of the very first games that we saw, not just in the arcade, but also at home.
Another thing worth noting is that a company like Apple was known for its creative, open work environment, but they credit it to Atari because Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak worked for Atari or did work for Atari at some point, and they took that culture and brought it over to Apple. And interestingly enough, both of those companies were some of the most successful companies at the time in Silicon Valley.
And it's kind of the same culture we see at Google now, which is interesting. So Google has kind of taken those roots of these early Silicon Valley companies. So it's pretty interesting. But now you're probably wondering if you're not too familiar, where are video games at now, and sort of, what can be done now in terms of the technology. And here are just some examples of, visually what these games look like in stills. But we did want to show you just two very short trailers of two distinctive types of video games. One is Journey, which is a very artistic open world exploration game, and you can actually interact with other players around the world, but there's no speech. So you actually interact via song, or sort of, I guess you would call it like notes, musical notes. And you sort of go around this world together, collecting basically fragments of your robe, and the more fragments you collect, the longer your robe becomes. So that's one. And then Uncharted is more of an adventure action game. So there's elements of traversing or jumping. There's elements of shooting, it's third-person shooter, right? Third-person shooting. So it's very different. These two games are very different, but we want to show you a clip of each. Okay. This is Uncharted. It's actually a series. So.
It was a nice lift back there, but you got a lot to learn. Crap. You stick with me and I'll teach you a few things.
No offense, but how do you know he's
My friends call me son.
Nathan Trent?
Mr. Sullivan. And Mr. Drake. Can you tell me what's so special about that ring?
It belongs in my family.
Describe this Francis Drake's motto.
Greatness from small beginnings. So what is it you're after?
That's just a little historical research.
Don't tell me you're buying into all that supernatural nonsense.
You love all this as much as I do.
No.
These guys are playing for keeps, right? So,
I'm going to go to the house of the Earth.
And then this is Journey. So as you can see, they're very different games, and we've come a long way from what Atari did, but without those first creative individuals that pushed the limits of that technology, we really wouldn't have what we have now. So thank you. And we're open to any questions that any of you might have. Thank you. So any questions? Sure.
How'd you guys get involved in this project? How did it get started?
Sorry.
You want to say?
No, we just basically read this book called Replay: The History of Video Games, 2011, and then 2013. We thought that it would be good to do the history as like a movie, as a visual thing, because we like film and stuff like that. And that's pretty much it. Then we did a Kickstarter, 2013, October, and then that went through, and we just went from there pretty much.
Yep. We were able to raise the funds, and then we got in touch with all of these early game designers, and we were able to fly out using the Kickstarter funds to be able to make the phone. So. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there a point at which I was struck by the radical difference between a game like Pong and the last few games that you showed us, where the most recent products stop being games and become simply a film, a narrative? Or are they always, is there something about the most recent versions that make them as much games as the earlier ones were?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, what you saw is a combination of sort of cinematic aspects, or what they call like sometimes the connections between a certain scene that you're playing and then where the character is going next. So instead of having you be that character, they'll play like a geez, what's the word? I can't think of. Cutscene. Yeah, they play a cutscene to sort of show that in a cinematic way, but you still have the gameplay elements. So there's still that aspect of there is a player, you are controlling the player, and you're basically moving the player through that world, through that universe that this person has created, or this. Now it's like huge team of people. So that's one of the big differences too. Before it was one or two people creating a game. Now it's hundreds of, sometimes thousands, creating a game. So yeah, the gameplay aspects are definitely still there, but there is sort of a kind of combination of these different mediums, because there is like that kind of cinematic aspect to it too.
I would say it's pretty much due to technology. Like, I think the approach in the beginning a lot of the time was, let's do something that's going to keep the quarters going into the machine, But there are some people who are doing, oh, I want to tell a story, I want to like do like something visual or like musical too. But I think it's just as the technology evolved, they were able to realize their vision more. So when you have like motion capture, it looks like people, you know, it's just a matter of technology and just the people who coming at it from that angle.
Yeah, a lot of actors are moving into video games and doing motion capture and being part of that. So it's interesting how these mediums are kind of interacting and working together. Mm-hmm.
I think you mentioned this, but I was just curious if do you know what the first game was that enabled the player to actually have a camera view option, like being able to control that element? I don't know.
Okay, do you know?
No, not.
I mean,
Off the top of my head,
yeah,
it would have to be.
I would think if
Yeah,
maybe
one
like
of
a
the
first-person
N64
shooter,
games.
like
Yeah.
Wolfenstein maybe.
Yeah.
To control the camera, I think it was 8 to state.
Maybe.
That's the first one. But that's normally where the camera control came from.
It could have been Mario as well.
Yeah.
Super Mario 64 came out before that, and then C buttons for camera control.
Right.
So
But yeah, it is an interesting addition because you get to also you're not only controlling the character, you're also controlling what are you seeing as the player, not just the character, especially if you're in a third person perspective. So it's really cool you brought that up. Yeah.
You talked about creative freedom at Atari. Nowadays with the big budgets and even if you sell, I think Square Enix said like they sold 3 million copies of Final Fantasy 13 and was still a commercial failure. Do you think with these big teams and such huge expectations that level of creativity with annual releases has gone down?
I mean, they do mention that in the movie from Bowser and the Crystal Castles. It basically says that the environment or the spirit of Atari lives on in the scene now.
Yeah,
or
that's
sorry,
right.
in the movie. But I personally don't think that there's a lack of creativity in the bigger productions. I think it's just like so much money, so many people on the boat, on the ship or whatever, that it's hard and not enough time. So it's just harder, I guess, to.
Yeah, there's
like,
a lot at stake.
What I've heard is that people have like a design document. Let's just say example. It's like, or
son is missing, or there's monsters attacking their village, and you have the choice of whether to help them or not. And how you go about that could potentially either make the situation better or worse. So I personally enjoy those games a lot because they force you to make choices, and that you kind of have to think about, and that might have repercussions later. So that's, I think I love those types of games. Yeah.
What are your views on the so-called walking simulator games like Everybody's Gone to Rapture or Gone Home or Dear Esther, where you're pretty much just walking around and it's a series of scripted events where maybe text comes up and it's just exposition about the world, but there's no end state, there's no failure state, and there's no seemingly goal in mind.
We actually had Everybody's Gone to the Rapture as one of the trailers, but they decided to come back on time. You haven't played? No, I played it, yeah. And I like it. I like those games. As far as like interactivity, I think that you kind of control the pacing. You can stop and look at something, or you can just keep going through it, even though that you can't really affect what happens.
I really like the Stanley Parable.
I don't know.
Any questions? You did great. Yeah.
Is there anywhere where we can see your film?
Yes. Online, www.world11movie.com. We actually have flyers right on the site, so please grab one and you can get them digitally.
It's also on Steam, but they get cut.
Yeah, so please buy on the website.
Piggybacking off of the Gone Home walking simulator question, game with minimal interactivity, are visual novels considered games?
What's a visual novel?
Okay, a visual novel, like two of the most common ones, like Fate Stay Night or Zucchini or something like that. It's like a game, you load it up on the computer or something, but you basically read text behind pictures, and the pictures illustrate some of what's going on, but it's primarily text. Some are choice driven, and very few are not choice driven. You just read through it until the end. But typically they have multiple routes and stuff, but it's about reading, and you just determine where the story goes, but you mostly read.
Well, it sounds, I guess, it sounds like an interactive novel where like you go to a certain page for a certain choice kind of thing. That's an interesting question because it's basically a novel transcribed into like an application. It's using visual aspects too, which a novel doesn't. It's using imagination. It leaves the reader the ability to imagine the world. So I guess there are those differences between sort of text versus game, also visual aspect.
I would say that if you can have two different playthroughs that are different, like you have multiple, I would say it's a game. I would say if you can control the camera, and you look at the sky, the other person looks at the ground, that's a game. If it's just like the same exact words printed in every book, that it's not.
No, the pictures are pretty static, but there's multiple routes, so different playthroughs can yield different results.
There are books like that though. Like,
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, like the Goosebumps books used to have.
Yeah.
certain
The only thing I guess
alternative
that
pages.
differentiates that would be